The crack of the whip split the Louisiana air like a pistol shot, sharp enough to make even the birds in the cypress trees fall silent. Beneath the punishing sun, Jeremiah staggered forward, a cotton bale nearly as large as his own body pressing into his spine. The coarse rope cut deep into his palms, his muscles trembled, and his knees threatened to buckle with every step. Sweat rolled into his eyes, stinging, but he dared not pause. A pause meant another lash. A pause meant Ransom's voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Move, boy, faster. Cotton weighs less than your hide, and yet you drag your feet." The overseer's voice carried over the fields, oily with contempt, laced with the cruel satisfaction of a man who knew his power was absolute. Mr. Thomas Ransom, broad of gut, red of face, and hard of eye, stood astride the packed earth like he owned the sun itself. A length of rawhide whip curled in his hand, snapping against the ground whenever Jeremiah faltered. Jeremiah bore the insult in silence. He did not answer, did not give Ransom the satisfaction of seeing rage crack his calm. Instead, he leaned forward, straining every sinew and pushed his body onward. His shoulders burned, his breath came ragged, and yet his jaw locked tight as stone. The cotton gin house loomed ahead, a hulking shadow against the white-hot glare. The bales were stacked inside, one upon another, rising toward the rafters like some suffocating mountain of labor. Jeremiah forced himself toward it, his body bending but never breaking. Behind him, the sounds of misery carried across the fields. The groans of the weary, the cries of the beaten, the steady rustle of burlap and rope. Jeremiah heard it all, though he did not turn. He had long since learned that turning meant punishment, but the cries still struck him like blows. He had heard his mother cry out that same way. It had been only days ago when she collapsed beneath the weight of her basket, her frail body unable to stand against the sun and the endless labor. Jeremiah had rushed to her side, but Ransom's whip had cracked across his back before he reached her. She was dragged aside like broken cargo, left to recover in the dirt while the others worked on. Jeremiah remembered the way her hand had clutched at his wrist, trembling, whispering his name. He remembered the shame in her eyes, the shame of weakness forced upon her by hunger and years of toil. And he remembered how Ransom had laughed. That laugh still echoed now as Jeremiah hauled his burden into the gin house. The air inside was stifling, thick with cotton dust that clung to his skin and filled his lungs. He hefted the bale onto the pile, his muscles screaming as he pushed it into place. For a moment he stood there, bent double, his hands braced on his knees as he fought for breath. From outside came another cry, a boy's voice, high and terrified. Jeremiah straightened, dust swirling around him, and stepped back into the blinding sun. The boy was no older than 12, thin as a stalk of cane, his bare back welted and raw. He had stumbled while dragging his load and now lay in the dirt, sobbing as Ransom's whip lashed across him again and again. "On your feet," Ransom barked. "On your feet, or I'll flay the skin from your bones." The boy tried to rise, arms trembling, knees buckling. Jeremiah felt the heat of rage stir in his chest, his fists curled at his sides, nails digging into his palms until blood slicked his hands. He took a single step forward but stopped himself. His mother's voice rose in his mind, soft and pleading, "Do not give them what they want. Endure. Endure until the time is right." So Jeremiah stood motionless, his face a mask of stone. The whip cracked again, and the boy staggered forward, dragging his basket like a corpse behind him. Ransom caught Jeremiah's stare. For a moment the overseer's lips curled into a sneer, as though daring him to speak, to move, to strike. Jeremiah lowered his gaze, but not before Ransom saw the flicker in his eyes, the quiet fire that no lash could extinguish. "Remember your place," Ransom growled. "Cotton first, your pride last." He turned away, snapping his whip against the earth, striding down the road to torment another. The sun bled toward the horizon before the labor slowed. Jeremiah's body screamed with exhaustion, his back wet with sweat, his throat raw from dust. He stumbled toward the quarters when the horn finally sounded, the promise of a meager meal and a moment's rest. The quarters lay low and crowded, wooden shacks pressed together at the edge of the fields. Chains clinked faintly in the distance, tethered to those deemed too unruly to trust. The air hung heavy, thick with silence broken only by coughs, whispers, and the shuffling of bare feet. Inside the quarters, the enslaved sat close together, their eyes hollow, their words scarce. A candle flickered weakly, throwing shadows across walls scarred with age. Jeremiah sank down onto the dirt floor beside his mother, who leaned against the wall, her breath shallow but steady. She reached for his hand, her fingers frail, her eyes searching his face. "You carry too much," she whispered. Jeremiah shook his head, his jaw tightening. "I carry what I must." Her hand lingered on his, trembling. "One day it will break you." He said nothing. He only looked at her, then at the others, faces bent with sorrow, children asleep in their mother's arms, men staring at the floor as though the dirt itself had swallowed their spirits. Beyond the thin walls, the night stretched dark and suffocating. The barns loomed like giants in the moonlight, their frames groaning beneath the weight of cotton. The chains clinked again, faint, ghostly. And somewhere in the distance, a whip cracked against the silence, even though the day was done. Jeremiah lay down on the dirt, his body aching, his eyes burning as he stared into the darkness. Around him, the quarters were hushed, the air thick with the suffocating weight of despair. But inside him burned something else, something the lash could not strip, nor hunger extinguish. He closed his eyes, the sound of Ransom's laughter echoing still, the image of his mother's collapse and the boy's bloodied back seared into his mind. The fire inside him smoldered, waiting. And though he slept, the weight of chains pressed down as heavy as the cotton he bore. The days bled into one another like wounds that never healed. Each sunrise carried the same merciless rhythm, the horn at dawn, the whip by noon, the silence of exhaustion by nightfall. Yet for Jeremiah, the burden grew heavier still, for Mr. Ransom had fixed his gaze on him with the malice of a wolf circling its strongest prey. "Let the giant carry it," Ransom sneered one morning, gesturing at a bale nearly twice the size of those given to the others. "If his back's so broad, let it break beneath something worthy." Jeremiah stepped forward in silence, his face unmoved, though every muscle in his arms quivered as he bent to lift the crushing weight. His body strained, rope biting into his hands until they bled. The others watched, their eyes wide, some with pity, others with fear. To show sympathy was dangerous. To show defiance worse still. Ransom delighted in Jeremiah's suffering. When Jeremiah staggered, Ransom's whip cracked across his back. When he bent to rest a moment too long, the overseer mocked him in front of all. "Your mama dropped her basket like a child," Ransom spat one afternoon. "Weakness runs in the blood. Seems it won't be long till you fall just like her." Jeremiah's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He forced himself to rise, lifting the bale higher, his silence sharper than any words. The cruelty grew more inventive. Ransom denied him food on evenings when Jeremiah failed to bow low enough in greeting. He ordered him to haul loads through the night, long after others had collapsed in their quarters. Once, when Jeremiah bent to drink water from a bucket, Ransom tipped it over with his boot, watching the mud soak into the earth while Jeremiah's lips cracked with thirst. "Drink that instead," he said, laughing. The laughter carried into the big house at night, where Ransom's voice was often overheard through open windows, loud and arrogant after too much whiskey. One evening, while delivering tools to the shed near the main porch, Jeremiah lingered in the shadows as Ransom's voice slithered out. "I'll break him before winter harvest," Ransom bragged to the plantation owner's son, his words heavy with drink. "Mark me, he'll kneel before me or crawl in the dirt like a whipped dog. No man's too big to snap." The men laughed, their glasses clinking, while Jeremiah stood in silence beneath the window. His shadow stretched long across the yard, but his face was a mask. He turned and walked back into the night, the words etched into his mind like scars. Whispers grew among the enslaved. Small rebellions flickered like candle flames in the dark. A tool misplaced here, a wagon wheel loosened there, a basket of cotton spoiled in the damp. Some said it was enough to remind themselves they were not entirely broken. Yet Jeremiah knew these sparks would never burn the house down. His vengeance, when it came, must be greater, not petty but permanent, something that would leave the ground itself trembling in memory. But still, he waited. The breaking point arrived on a sweltering afternoon when the air itself seemed thick with menace. The enslaved were hauling carts across the yard, wheels groaning under the weight of loaded bales. One man, Samuel, older, slower, with a limp that made every step agony, lagged behind. Ransom's eyes found him at once. "Move it, cripple," he barked, striding forward, whip curling in his fist. Samuel tried, straining at the cart, but his leg betrayed him. The wheel caught a rut in the dirt, the cart tilting dangerously. Samuel stumbled, falling to his knees. The whip cracked once, twice. Samuel cried out, clutching at the dirt. Jeremiah stepped forward instinctively but froze when Ransom's eyes cut toward him. The overseer smiled, a cruel curve of lips as though daring Jeremiah to act. Then with deliberate malice, Ransom shoved the heavy cart. The wheel lurched from the rut. The cart rolled, unstoppable, and before Samuel could crawl clear, it crushed him with a sickening crack. His cry ended in silence. For a moment the yard froze. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The enslaved stood motionless, their eyes wide with horror. Samuel lay still, the weight of the cart pinning him, dust settling over his broken body. Ransom wiped the sweat from his brow and shrugged. "Should have moved faster." Then he laughed. The sound hollowed Jeremiah's chest like a blow. His hands trembled, his vision blurred with rage so sharp it almost blinded him. Every instinct screamed to leap forward, to seize Ransom by the throat, to end him then and there. But he did not move. Instead, Jeremiah sank to his knees, bowing his head so low that his forehead touched the dirt. To Ransom, it looked like submission. To the others, perhaps despair. But Jeremiah's eyes, hidden in the shadow of his bent body, burned with something else entirely. He stared at the towering stacks of cotton bales by the gin house, their weight pressing down on the groaning beams that held them. He listened to the creak of ropes straining under the burden. He imagined, for the first time, what it would look like if that weight came down not on a slave, but on the man who wielded the whip. The vision burned itself into him, searing through grief, through fury, through the silence he had carried for so long. When he rose again, he lifted his bale without a word. But his silence was no longer empty. It was heavy. It was waiting. Ransom smirked, mistaking that silence for defeat. He turned away, snapping his whip at another, swaggering like a man untouchable. But in the shadows of the cotton barn, Jeremiah's mind had already begun to weave. The weeks that followed Samuel's death hung heavy as the Louisiana air, a silence stretched taut across the quarters. Nobody spoke of what they had seen, but the horror lived in their eyes. The cart had crushed more than Samuel. It had crushed the last illusion that mercy might ever dwell on that land. For Jeremiah, silence was now his weapon. He bent lower when Ransom passed, his back curved as though submission had finally bent the iron of his spine. He took on the heaviest loads without protest, lifting bales that should have taken 2 men to carry. He kept his voice low, his eyes on the ground. To anyone watching, he looked like a man broken, and Ransom believed it. "See there," the overseer bragged one evening, pointing Jeremiah out to a fellow hand. "Told you, even giants fall if you lean on him long enough. He's mine now, nothing left but muscle and obedience." The lie tasted sweet on Ransom's tongue, but Jeremiah, behind the mask of obedience, was watching, always watching. He watched the gin house most of all. The structure rose dark and hulking against the horizon, its beams thick but weathered, its roof sagging with the weight of the harvest. Inside, cotton bales towered like pale tombstones, bound with rope and lifted into place by a system of pulleys and wooden frames. Jeremiah studied how the beams groaned when too many were stacked together, how the ropes strained, how the pulleys slipped if tied wrong. When ordered to secure a stack, Jeremiah worked slowly, his hands deliberate. Where Ransom saw laziness, Jeremiah saw opportunity. He began to loosen knots just enough that they would strain under weight. He shifted beams a fraction out of line, setting stress where it could fester unseen. He nudged bales into precarious positions, heavy enough to seem stable but ready to topple with the right push. It was dangerous work, done under the eye of a man who would kill for less. But Jeremiah never faltered. He carried the mask of obedience so well that even the enslaved around him began to fear he had surrendered. Some pitied him, some resented him, but none knew the truth. He told them nothing. His silence was not cowardice but strategy. Secrecy was the only shield he had. At night, when the quarters sank into exhausted stillness, Jeremiah lay awake staring at the rafters. He listened to the chains clinking faintly in the distance, the coughs of the sick, the muffled sobs of women who had nothing left to give. His mind replayed the groan of wood, the creak of rope, the thunder of collapsing weight. He imagined it again and again, Ransom buried under what he loved most, smothered by the cotton he had forced others to haul. The vision did not soothe him, but it gave him purpose. Then came the day his sister dropped her basket. She was young, no more than 14, her body thin from hunger and labor. The basket slipped from her hands as she staggered under the sun, cotton spilling across the dirt like snow. She gasped, scrambling to gather it, but Ransom was already there. "You clumsy bitch," he roared, his whip flashing. The leather split the air, striking her back. She cried out, stumbling, but he struck again, each lash carving fire into her skin. Jeremiah froze where he stood, his own basket balanced on his shoulders. His entire body shook with the effort of restraint. He could feel every lash as though it split his own flesh, but he did not move. If he moved, he would lose everything. The others saw his face and looked away. His eyes burned with such fire that none could meet them. They feared it would consume them too. Ransom, laughing, left her crumpled in the dirt. "Pick it up or starve," he sneered before striding away to torment another. Jeremiah set his basket down with careful precision, his hands steady though his body trembled. He walked to his sister, helped her to her knees, and without a word gathered the spilled cotton back into her basket. He said nothing, but in his silence was a vow. That night, when the quarters sank into uneasy rest, Jeremiah did not sleep. He stepped outside, the moon spilling pale light across the fields, the barns, the trees heavy with moss. The air smelled of damp earth and sweat. He stood alone, his shadow long across the dirt, and raised his face to the sky. His voice was low but steady as he spoke words meant only for himself and the night. "He will be crushed," Jeremiah said, "as he has crushed us. By the same weight he worships, by the same burden he forced upon our backs. He will feel it, he will know it." The wind stirred, rattling the branches, carrying his vow into the dark. From that night on, every step, every breath, every motion of Jeremiah's hands bent toward that vow. His silence was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a blade sharpening in the dark. And in the gin house, the cotton bales loomed like a beast in waiting, groaning against their bindings, eager for release. The harvest swelled to its peak, a season of exhaustion so deep it blurred the line between waking and death. The fields had been stripped bare, the cotton picked clean, and now it lay imprisoned in towering bales that filled the gin house to its rafters. The building groaned with the weight, beams straining, ropes creaking, dust floating through the air like a suffocating haze. Inside, the mountain of cotton loomed, white and heavy, a monument to misery. Ransom strutted through the yard like a king surveying his kingdom. Sweat streaked his ruddy face, his whip hung loose at his side, and a flask swung from his belt. He was drunk with power, drunk with whiskey, drunk with the sight of labor bent into profit. "Up there," he barked, pointing at Jeremiah. "The giant climbs, let's see if he can manage the heights." Jeremiah obeyed without hesitation, stepping into the gin house where shadows clung like cobwebs. He placed his hands on the rough beams and began to climb. Muscles strained, rope scraped his palms, but his movements were deliberate, unhurried. He climbed higher, past rows of stacked bales that seemed to press inward with every step. At the top, near the rafters, he paused. The final bale weighted, massive and swaying, its bulk enough to flatten a man. Jeremiah's breath came steady as he pulled at the ropes, guiding them into place. To Ransom, who leered from below, it looked like obedience. To Jeremiah, it was the moment his vow would breathe. He tied knots that appeared secure, but only just so. He shifted the bale so that its balance rested on the weakest point of the beam. He looped the rope through the pulley, his hands steady, his mind sharp, and then left one rope dangling loose, hidden but ready. "Hurry it up, boy!" Ransom shouted, his voice echoing off the timbered walls. "You move slower than a mule stuck in mud." Jeremiah did not answer. He lowered his head as though shamed and began his careful descent. Step by step, he moved down, the dust swirling around him. From below, the other enslaved men and women paused in their work, their eyes flicking between the overseer and the giant who moved like a shadow across the bales. Ransom spat on the ground, snapping his whip against the dirt. "I'll be damned if it ain't the sight of the century." The giant bowing to his master. Jeremiah reached the ground and stepped aside, his silence deep as the earth. Ransom swaggered forward, his boots heavy, his laughter thick. "Let me see what kind of work a broken back can manage." He tilted his head back, squinting at the bale swaying above. His hands rested on his hips, smug, unafraid. He barked another insult, but the words never finished. Jeremiah's hand closed around the loose rope. With a single deliberate tug, the world shifted. The bale shuddered. The beam groaned. The pulley screamed as the knot slipped loose. For a breathless instant, the gin house seemed to inhale. Then came the roar. Cotton thundered downward, a white avalanche of crushing weight. The bales cascaded like a river breaking its dam, ropes snapping, beams splintering as the mountain gave way. Dust exploded into the air, choking, blinding, filling the gin house with a storm of pale smoke. Ransom's scream tore through the chaos, high and panicked, before it was silenced beneath the first impact. A massive bale struck him squarely, driving him into the dirt with a sound like snapping branches. Another followed, and another, until the overseer was no longer visible, swallowed whole by the very burden he had forced others to carry. The noise ended as suddenly as it began. The avalanche settled, the cotton lying in heavy drifts across the floor, ropes dangling like broken snakes from the rafters. A silence thicker than death spread through the gin house. Jeremiah stood at the edge of the wreckage, his chest rising and falling, dust coating his skin like ash. His eyes fixed on the mound of cotton beneath which Ransom lay crushed. There was no tremor in his body now, no sign of fear or hesitation, only calm. Behind him, the others emerged slowly, their faces pale in the drifting haze. They looked from Jeremiah to the wreckage, their expressions caught between awe and terror. One crossed himself, whispering a prayer. Another murmured, voice trembling, "He's done it." Whispers rippled through them like wind through dry grass. Some clutched their children, shielding their eyes from the sight. Others stared openly, as though seeing Jeremiah for the first time, not as a man among them, but as something larger, something inevitable. The gin house creaked, beams still settling. Dust swirled in shafts of light, glowing like smoke from a holy fire. Jeremiah turned away, his face unreadable, his silence louder than any cry. The overseer who had prided himself on breaking others lay buried beneath the very cotton he worshipped. And in that silence, Jeremiah's vow was fulfilled. The avalanche left more than silence in its wake. It left a wound in the heart of the plantation. Dust still hung in the air when the news spread like wildfire. The overseer was gone, buried beneath the very cotton he had worshipped, his bones shattered beneath the weight he had once forced upon others. The master stormed from the big house when he heard, his face pale with rage, his voice trembling as he demanded answers. Yet beneath the fury lay fear, palpable, sharp, and new. Ransom had been their iron fist, their shield of cruelty. If he could fall so suddenly, so completely, what protection did they have against the silent strength of those they had enslaved? The white men whispered among themselves that night. Some called it an accident, blaming rotten beams and poor knots. Others swore it was sabotage, though no one dared say whose hands had pulled the rope. A few muttered darker tales, that Jeremiah had summoned spirits, that the devil himself had guided the cotton down to claim ransom. And still others, trembling as they crossed themselves, whispered of divine justice, that God had chosen his own instrument of vengeance. In the quarters, the enslaved spoke in hushed tones, though no overseer pressed them to silence now. Some prayed in whispers, not for mercy, but in honor of the act. Others wept, not with sorrow, but with something sharper, like hope. For the first time in memory, the whip had fallen silent, and Jeremiah. He did not run. While others urged him to flee into the swamps, to vanish into the wilds before the patrols came, Jeremiah only shook his head. His silence, the same silence that had shielded him all along, held steady now. He walked back to the quarters as though returning from another day's labor. He sat on the dirt floor beside his mother, whose frail hand trembled as it touched his. "They will come," she whispered. "Yes," he answered. "Then why do you stay?" Jeremiah lifted his gaze, his eyes calm, burning with the fire that no whip had ever quenched. "Because they must know it was no accident, because they must remember." When the patrols arrived at dawn, armed and restless, they found him waiting. He sat straight-backed, his hands resting on his knees, his face unflinching. The men hesitated, their guns trembling, for there was no fear in him, only the steady weight of a man who had chosen his end. The enslaved gathered as he was dragged away, but they did not cry out. They bowed their heads, whispering prayers that were not for his salvation, but for his name. His defiance had already become larger than his body. The execution was swift, brutal, designed to terrify. They whipped him until flesh tore from bone, chained him before the quarters so all might see. Yet Jeremiah did not scream. He bore it with the same silence that had carried him through every lash, every burden, every insult. When at last they hung him, his eyes found the gin house one final time, the barn that still groaned under the memory of his vengeance. And then, with a final breath, he was gone. But Jeremiah did not vanish. In the days that followed, whispers became legend. The enslaved spoke of him not as a man who died, but as one who transformed cotton into a weapon, who crushed cruelty with the very burden it had laid upon him. Mothers told the story to their children by candlelight, their voices low but fierce. He carried the weight, and then he made it fall. The plantation never returned to its old order. The workers still labored, but their eyes held a new fire. Overseers, once arrogant, now flinched when the bales groaned on their beams, when ropes strained and pulleys creaked. The cotton itself seemed to mutter with threat, as if Jeremiah's hands lingered in every fiber. Rumors spread beyond the fields, carried by travelers and whispers at markets. Some told it as a tale of horror, others as a parable of justice. And slowly, in the hush of night, his name became a quiet hymn of defiance. The gin house stood, but it was never the same. Dust clung stubbornly to its beams, no matter how many times it was swept. Silence settled heavy within it, the kind of silence that remembers. And when the wind blew, some swore they could hear the echo of cotton falling like a roar that would never end. Jeremiah's revenge was not only against ransom. It was against the system that sought to bury him beneath chains and silence. In the end, it was not Jeremiah who lay buried, but the overseer, crushed beneath the cotton that had broken so many backs, silenced by the very weight he once wielded as a weapon. And in the ashes and whispers that followed, Jeremiah lived on. Jeremiah carried the burden meant to break him, and in the end, he turned it into the weapon that buried his tormentor. His silence became a roar and his defiance a legend. What do you think? Was his vengeance justice or damnation? Share your thoughts below and subscribe for more stories that history tried to silence.